I'd like to thank our sponsor of today's podcast, OS Nexus. OS Nexus is an industry leader in software defined storage, enabling organizations to deploy fast and reliable file, block, and object storage on integrated platforms from Seagate and Supermicro. Choose the easy way to scale and accelerate your storage needs with reduced costs and less. Go to osnexus.com/try now and mention Data Protection Gumbo to get your expanded community edition license free. And now for my conversation with Lee Caswell. Welcome back to another edition of Data Protection Gumbo. I am your host, Demetrius Malbro. Super excited to be here again, and I have the pleasure of speaking to Lee Caswell, who is the SVP of Product and Solutions Marketing over at Nutanix. So Lee, welcome back to the Gumbo. How are you today?
Yeah, Demetrius, thanks so much. It's a delight to be here.
Yeah, and you wrote a blog post around non-predictions for VMware users of unexpected Broadcom consequences back in January. And so let's talk about that if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, I think that's, it's a really important topic for a lot of customers trying to navigate what does the future look like, right? Where, for VMware users and even, employees and partners, right? I mean, the landscape has materially changed. And this has been a hard thing, I think, to accommodate for many people because they've built their data centers in large part around virtualization, right? Starting with compute virtualization, moving into now like hyper-converged virtualization, if you will. And they're trying to assess, like, what does that look like? Because, in the 20 years since the hypervisor was invented, we've really seen a commoditization of that layer. And, you move up the stack. I think it was Andy Grove who said, he who gets commoditized last wins. Yeah. Right. And so what we're finding, right, is that, yeah, you can go try and charge for that element. But the very first prediction is customers know and expect that they will pay more. They're still figuring out in many cases how that's going to happen. But that's the first thing that customers are figuring out.
Yeah. And I've seen and heard some rumblings in the market that individuals and customers are, I guess, a little confused. And so I want to ask you, I guess, how should existing customers like engage with, and let's talk your area. So software, so storage area networks and NAS providers, right? How do they ensure that the total cost of ownership and the return on investment models are accurately updated to reflect the new licensing costs, right? Because there's some new licensing in place right now. So what do you think about that with an overall TCO and ROI and how customers should really be looking at that as far as the new licensing model that you have heard of?
Yeah. Well, since the early days of virtualization, right, there's $3 of storage sold for every dollar of virtualization. That's why VMware was bought by EMC for, because it was such a high leverage point, right? And, for storage systems. And at the same time, then, the idea was you were going to consolidate servers. And that ROI was magic the first time it happened, right? The ability to go and take, let's say, 3 or 4 or 5 servers and consolidate it into a single physical server running virtual servers, right, was an amazing way to consolidate hardware and pay for the storage, right? And that was great the first time you did it. Now, the second time, it was like, well, wait a minute. Now that I'm buying this the next time, right, the ROI was actually, now actually played out, right? And then what happens now is if the price of the hypervisor, doubles or triples, all of a sudden what's happening is customers are looking, saying, hey, the effective cost of running in a storage system is actually, traditional, let's say, NAS or SAN system, right, is actually a lot higher. And so, customers are having to rework what the ROI looks like. And so, what we're encouraging customers, I'm talking to customers about is, maybe your next storage refresh should become a server refresh. Instead of thinking about storage systems, proprietary storage, which run, by the way, you could just look at, pick your storage company, right? They run at 85% gross margins. So think about that, right? The cost of these systems, these are high margin systems, right? But now if you start thinking, well, wait a minute, now like these just got relatively more expensive, what we're watching is the ROI times of a next storage refresh can extend out by 1, 2, or 3 years. And that starts to change the equation of maybe it's time to move to a server-based system like every modern cloud.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because you also have to look at the angle with channel partners as far as
Hmm.
MSPs, and there are
Right.
a lot of MSPs out there that leverage VMware and that entire virtualization technology
You bet.
because it's a matter of doing more with less. And there are what about 65,000 reseller partners and about
Yeah.
4,500 active cloud and hyperscalers that are out there. So just imagine the cost of how they are now looking at larger bills, et cetera. And so, how will channel partners reduce, I guess, the VMware investment that they are now faced with from your perspective?
Yeah, I think you bring up two really important constituents here, right? So there's the channel partners themselves, right? Where for them, the fact that Broadcom is taking the top 2,000 customers direct means, those aren't the small customers, by the way, right? Those are the biggest ones.
Yeah,
Those are the ones that are, if it's half of VMware revenue, which is say, $13.5 billion, let's say, that's $6.7 billion of basically, selling product that just disappears. And, 10% margin, that's like almost $700 million, right? So it's a really big dollar figure. So what we're going to expect to see is that channel partners will be investing less going forward in VMware solutions because there's just less money going around in the system, right? By design, right? And Broadcom's taking that money for themselves, right? And their shareholders. And so I think this is a material miscalculation because Broadcom has experience selling chips, for example. And when you sell silicon, there's a design in cycle. You get the product designed in. It's an intense set of activities up front, and then basically you live with that for until the next design cycle, right? And certainly there's some moderate changes during that time, but these are firmware changes, right? But when you think about infrastructure support, that's materially different. And that's why do you have 65,000 resellers involved? It's because the activity of keeping infrastructure up and running, and particularly with security risks, right? You start thinking
yeah,
about like Log4j and things like that, right? The ability to go and patch these systems right quickly is a support model that Nutanix has built its business based on. And also what's interesting going forward, right? We think, and I'm a personal big believer in the fact that when you can upgrade to a remediated security posture with a single click across virtualized storage, compute, and networking all at one time, you're going to get basically remediated faster.
right.
That speed, right, is super important. So that's how I see the channel partners are going to be reconsidering how much investment goes into VMware solutions, number one. And for customers who are, have been dependent on that, they're going to have a different experience. And, that's before we get to the MSPs, that's the next one. But let me ask you about that. Does that resonate with you? Like, how do you think, the support of infrastructure should be, really considered?
Yeah, so just from my perspective around support for infrastructure, to me, number one, if you are supporting infrastructure, whether it's on-prem or it's virtualized out, then you definitely have to take advantage of some type of artificial intelligence because you need that efficiency. And
Hmm.
everyone right now is trying to get skin in the game with a co-pilot or some type of generative AI capability. But for me, in order to be smart and efficient, you definitely have to kind of automate some of these support functions as well. And of course, if you do that, then you're going to automatically gain some of the cost benefits and TCO and ROI benefits on the back end, to mention that as well. And plus, we don't want to talk about layoffs as much because those are things that are happening quite often nowadays.
Hmm.
And I don't really think AI is going to really affect that right now as far as positions and humans that will actually be the
Sure.
ones, still answering support calls, etc. But AI is definitely here, and we will of course see some effects of AI in the future as well. Are you also seeing something around artificial intelligence? What are you seeing just from an AI perspective within your coffers there?
Yeah, I'll start off with the idea that AI applied to infrastructure, right? It was traditionally it's been called AI ops, right, is, alive and well and doing, so we have, for example, introduced the ability to have, let's call it anomaly bands. And so the anomaly bands are monitored real time, and you can start looking at spikes, for example, right? That look outside of what your normal activity would look like. That's extremely important for things like performance management. So, starting to do performance management, so you don't have to go and basically look at the complex interaction of these proprietary systems, storage, SAN systems, SAN switches, for example, and take instead, you can start looking at that from a VM perspective. That's one of the big advantages of moving to a modern, server-based infrastructure.
Right, right.
We can look at the VM out, and now I can start looking at like IOPS and RAM and CPU utilization and storage bandwidth, and I can look at it within these bands, right? So AI ops can help dramatically. There's another area that's pretty interesting also, especially for this, for your audience, I think, on data protection is, uh, if you have experience with filers and, object stores and block systems and cloud systems. I mean, every restore process is different in
Okay. Yeah.
traditional architectures. Like, I mean, you face a lot of expertise, right, in knowing, what each of the power systems, right, within, at least one of our competitors, right. And you start thinking about that, like, wow, now you've got all this expertise. There's actually quite a simplification opportunity here if you can have a single consolidated snapshot system that goes across blocks, files, objects, VMs, containers, on-prem, and into the public cloud.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's we're talking to customers about that because, it's always snapshot is always that's the thing you do, but restore is the time when you're stressed, right? And so if you can go and start having a common way to restore, you start thinking about that. And then what's interesting is you're watching some companies now start to apply RAG, right, or retrieval augmented
That is
generation,
correct. Right.
and applying that to the data itself. And
Hmm.
that becomes super interesting, I think, about, it's not just about protecting the data. It's how do I get more value out of the data over
Yeah.
time? Then your career actually becomes more valuable.
I agree, and I've been around for 20 something years, and so you may have me on that front, but I'm not calling you
I definitely
old.
do.
But I started in 1999, and this was Y2K was the it thing that the dates are going to kind of roll off, and oh, there's a whole pie in the sky is falling
Right.
scenario with Y2K, but we are well beyond Y2K, and now we're having conversations about generative AI and
Sure.
self-driving cars and what's going to happen in the future when it pertains to artificial intelligence, etc. And so, one question I do have for you, and one more thing that you mentioned in that blog also was that VMC may no longer be a VMware managed service.
Yeah, there's a
What are
lot
your
of
thoughts there?
there's a lot of rumors. Certainly, this is Broadcom's decision to make, right? And so you watch them. They had a year to go and prepare effectively, right,
Yeah.
for this time frame, right? And so they ended up spinning off the end user computing business, right? So that was
Hmm.
expected, right? They packaged up the carbon black piece with their endpoint devices, right? And so you're watching kind of these underlying things. One of the things that's interesting in the VMC area, right, is that VMC is a managed service. And so,
Okay.
to look at who's managing the service, you look at whose initial goes first, right? So
Hmm.
VMC is managed by VMware. Azure VMware Solutions is managed by Azure, and Oracle VMware, is managed by Oracle, and Google Cloud VMware Engine, right, is managed by Google. So they're all managed in different ways.
Right.
So for the user, that's like, oh golly, like that means that there's no license portability across these elements, right? Because you can't go and take your license; it's managed by somebody else, right? In that case, so that's it. But the industry, what was expected, right, is VMC as a managed service introduced a cost of goods. I mean, there's actually equipment running, that VMware was paying for, and the expectation is that that's not something Broadcom is looking to do. And so we'll have to see. It's their call on what happens there. But it's my expectation that you're going to see VMC change in its nature, and that the real way this plays out effectively is you have a customer managed system. That's what customers want. Is you customer managed means you can bring your own security policies. It also means you can use your own credits. right? So I can use credits easily across all these systems. And I've got this seamless portability where now you can move from this, what we call hybrid cloud, right? Which is one data center into one cloud, let's say.
Right,
And you
right.
actually move to multi-cloud, or think of it as cross cloud. And, none of the hyperscalers are very interested in that, by the way, right? So we see that, opening up, by the way, one of the reasons this is going to open up is you're watching the egress fees start to go and drop back, right? That's an
Right.
important
Yeah.
element, right? Customers are demanding that because they're like, hey, it's my data. Like, why am I paying to get my data like to another cloud, for example, right? And so that we think is going to reduce friction for this new model. We call it hybrid multi-cloud.
Hybrid multi-cloud. Okay.
Yeah.
And you know what? We can't have a conversation without at least touching on the cybersecurity angle
Yeah.
and some of the attacks that are happening out there.
You
We
bet.
we are continuing to hear lots of stories about supply chain breaches, and I
Right.
mean, there. I just saw something around AT&T, and from 2019, 73 million records exposed, and
Wow.
this is years later. So it's a
Yeah.
matter of when, right, when you get hacked, because it's not if anymore. And so is around the storage capability of it and being able to store that data safely, and regardless of where it's stored, it has to be stored somewhere. What are you seeing and what are you hearing within your conversations just around being able to store that data in the most secure fashion, just from
Yeah.
your angle and your lens?
Yeah. I think there's no question, right, that security bumps everything, right? That's the top priority list, right? CIOs are most concerned there, right? Because that's actually, job threatening at the, at the least, right? And, company and reputation, brand, everything's affected, right? When there's a breach. And so, it is a top of mind issue. I think two things that I'm hearing. Number one is, all right, I'm getting past the idea that I might get hacked. I'm getting attacked more. And so now what I have to do is think about what is the next step? What happens
Okay.
when I'm attacked, right? And so, we have a product called Nutanix Data Lens, for example. It started off as file analytics, right? So it was like, hey, we can go and look at who's accessing things, right? And you get access controls and things like that, of course, right? But
Okay.
the idea was, now if you can start applying AI again and start thinking about anomaly detection, well, now what about if like a whole set of files simultaneously start getting written to or encrypted? That sounds suspicious, right? And it turns out there's some pretty interesting access patterns, signatures that you can go and apply. And so we've done this for ransomware, although it actually works for other things, but ransomware is actually the top name one. But it says, in a ransomware attack, these are the likely activities that you're going to see. And what we'll do is then notify you within 15 minutes. So now the idea is, okay, now I've been notified, right? So that's the first step, right? So I know something's happening. Now the question is, how fast can you get back to a protected state? And so you start thinking about like that ability to have a single restore process, right? Across your files and then back into your blocks, for example. This gives you a really interesting leverage point. And this is a big issue when, I'm traveling in a couple of weeks, right? Into, I don't know, I've gone to South Dakota for the first time,
Okay.
Omaha, like, Kansas
Yeah.
City. And these folks are really struggling with the race for talent. And so what they're looking at is if you have all these different teams with all this specialty, right? And now you have to go and basically operate when there's an attack underway, which is like, that's a really stressful time. I think of it like weddings and funerals, right? You basically have people who don't do something very often, right? With a very high risk environment. There's a lot of stress involved. So now you start thinking, hey, listen, I could go and basically use a single, a common team and have a very quick restore process. Or if there's a security process, if there's a security update and it affects any one of the network security, or sorry, network, compute, or storage elements, I can go and upgrade those all at the same time. So that's really helping us. For example, we have about 30% of our customers actually run vSphere, right, with our distributed storage stack.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
for those customers, what they're finding is if I have two different systems, it takes longer to go and upgrade a patch right across both systems. Whereas if I had an all Nutanix system, for example, I could go and basically upgrade all of it at one time. And so now I'm talking about minutes, where the other process probably days, maybe even weeks.
And we can go on and on and on about security and ransomware, because there's always so many different angles that you can approach it from. There's a
Yeah.
compliance and governance regulations. perspective as well. And you mentioned your product was named, it was analytics, and then it morphed into something else,
Exactly.
because analytics is not as a sexy term these days, right? We want to change it from a marketing perspective, right, and make it something
Yeah.
a little more easily digestible for customers to actually, get a hold of. And so one thing that I am seeing on my end is that what we're seeing is that the whole cyber recovery aspect, and making sure that you are, doing things like tabletop exercises, you're rehearsing,
Mhm.
and you don't just do that with the backup team or the
Right.
security
Exactly.
team. I mean, you go up to the board, CEO, legal, PR, marketing. So everyone is participating within this entire tabletop exercise, and you're rehearsing just like it's a real attack. So when the stress is on, you have some type of muscle memory, and you are able to basically recover a lot quicker because you've gone through that exercise before, right?
Yeah, it's like EMT training, right? I mean, there's
Yeah.
basically now you're like, oh, okay, I've seen this before. I know how it works. It's an interesting one, actually, Demetrius, around how we're watching customers extend to the public cloud.
Okay.
So one of the ways to think about using public cloud resources is you can use that for a DR scenario where you can go and fail over into the public cloud, fail back,
Hmm.
right? And it
Right.
gives you the ability, right, to do that perhaps while you're consolidating like a secondary DR target. And so that gives you the flexibility to say, hey, I've got the ability to go and store the data. Now, the data has to be active and live, but the compute instances can be on demand. And so I see this as a really interesting way to start making DR on like an something where we're watching. I'm seeing more of this where customers are saying, "Hey, I'm going to go and actually just run in a DR scenario
Hmm.
for a bit in order to basically make sure that this actually works." Because the problem is, you put these plans in place, and one of the things I had in the early part of my career, I was auditing DR systems. Right, I worked for GE in my
Oh,
first,
really?
and it was fascinating because these are all independent entities. People had plans, but they hadn't tried them. And so what you
Okay.
wanted to go back and find out was if you actually tried to go and do the work, things broke. So now what you can start to think about is how can I make this active DR, right? Where I actually do failover and then I do fail back, right? And I run in a different way. So to me, it's a little bit like you remember when vMotion came about, right? So vMotion, right, initially was thought of many customers, right, like, oh, I'm going to go in for maintenance purposes. I'll move one VM to another server. And that eliminates the need to have the identically configured server because it was virtual. So, because the old process, by the way, was you had to set up a completely identical maintenance server, right? That you had with the same applications, right? Fail it
Yeah.
over, shut down the first one, update the first one, and then fail back, right? Here's what happened. Over time, DRS came available, right? Where now you could start thinking, hey, I'm going to dynamically move workloads across servers at will. And
Okay.
that became now a new operating model. And I think we have the opportunity to introduce the same type of flexibility for DR, where instead of going, it's failover to one site and then failover back, it's like, no, I'm going to have this dynamic, optimally set of located data and applications. And now it's not just about failover and fail back. Now I can start thinking, well, for performance reasons or cost reasons, or even for security and privacy reasons, I'm going to start moving data on the fly. A natural disaster is coming. Hey, maybe now it's time to go and fail over to a different site and do that like ahead of the event instead of post event. It's a really interesting opportunity to think about how data protection, right, starts becoming more of an active, proactive, activity.
That is correct, and I'm glad you mentioned that, and we'll begin to wrap up here as well. Is that so? Having an environment so cloud natively
Yeah.
that you can automatically spin up resources, and that's one thing that I really felt that VMware changed the game when it comes to. I mean, it just changed the entire model of operating and running a business, because now you have this entire virtualized environment that you can automate. You can write PowerShell scripts and Terraform, and you can do all these DevOpsy. Is that even a word? But so
I think
maybe
DevOpsy works.
maybe I should patent that word, DevOpsy type things, right?
Yeah.
Where you can now start to automate these processes, and I'm seeing a lot of automated disaster recovery and resources are being spun up. And
Right.
now you can actually have these resources automatically running in the cloud on virtualized infrastructure, et cetera. So
Well, and to
yeah.
your point, right, on cybersecurity, right, the ability to have a stretched VPC, for example, right?
Okay.
You can bring your own security policies. So that's where our, Nutanix clusters or NC2 product, right? We weren't first in this space. I mean, VMware was first and had more, still has more clouds, but the ability to do it the right way, which is stretched integrated security, cross cloud data, portability, and then license portability, all customer managed. We think that's the right way this is going to play out.
I know I learned a few things here within this conversation as well, and maybe a final shout out, or how the audience can actually reach out to you, maybe on LinkedIn or
Yeah, you bet.
somewhere.
Yeah, so it's very complicated. Lee Caswell at LinkedIn. You'll find me there. There's a lot going on right now. This full stack outcome, right, that we've got is actually encouraging customers of all kinds, right, to come. And what's interesting is, the largest VMware customers are now taking a look at Nutanix because they're looking, hey, maybe this is the moment, right, to go and modernize the infrastructure. So new apps deserve new infrastructure, right? Hybrid cloud, hybrid multi-cloud in nature. It's a great, opportunity. And I always appreciate talking to you. I learned something too today. So thank you, Demetrius.
Absolutely. And I just want to say as well, thank you for being a guest on the show, and giving of your time
Of course.
as well. And I want to let the Gumbo listeners know that we do have a backup and recovery professionals group on LinkedIn. There's over 26,000 professionals,
Wow.
such as myself, backup recovery, cybersecurity, storage. There's so many. So go check out the group, become a member as well, join and participate in the conversations. Also, so this video will be on YouTube. So if you're watching from YouTube, then please give it a thumbs up if you like what you hear. And also subscribe as well, since this is a newly launched channel on YouTube. So Lee, once again, thank you so much for being a guest on the show.
Always a pleasure, Demetrius. Thanks so much.